Thank you all for coming. This is a special program tonight because the Dutchess County Historical Society and Clinton Historical Society locked out, and you're going to hear about that story as to how lucky we were, and they will be telling that story. I'd like to introduce the Dutchess County Historical Society archivist, Melody Moore, and Bill Jeffway, the executive director, and they're going to take over now, and we'll get started on our journey to Clinton Hollow.
Thank you. I need to juggle the microphone, right?
Yes.
Cool.
Well, you're up first.
Oh, I am.
Yes, you are.
Do you want
I'm,
to use this or not?
yeah, that would be good.
Forward and forward.
Excellent. So, it may take us a minute to get used to the technology. Huh? Oh. Oh. So I think, yeah, I have to get my head around this. There's no PA system, but there is a microphone, so it can't be too loud for this camera, but it has to be loud enough for you. So bear with us while we get ready. But Craig mentioned, or Cynthia mentioned the year of the veteran that we'd been kind of working our way off of, and then think. Oh, good. Okay. I wonder. Yeah. It's okay.
Could you hold it for me?
How do I look? Is my hair right? So, what we're beginning to look at, believe it or not, it's time to start thinking about the year 2020, and we were thinking to ourselves, well, it's the 100th anniversary of women's national suffrage. They were able to vote at a state level a couple of years earlier. What might we do? And we decided to celebrate women's voices in. Oh, that's all right. What else can happen? This is fun. Keeps me on my toes. 100th anniversary of national. So we are going to be looking at women in Dutchess County. We said voices and talents, as in kind of political voices, but also the many talents that women have, especially when they start to get into more untraditional areas. We've had some interesting looks into some of the women from Clinton in the early 1800s who were very influenced or were Quakers. And as Quakerism declined, it's interesting to look at what they went and did and how they brought their Quaker principles to bear, not just through Quakerism, but beyond that. So there's a lot for the women's voices and talents next year that will relate to Clinton. The idea being that tonight is one of those first ones. We're focusing on women's voices and talents in the town of Clinton on Ms. Ophelia Shadbolt Amy. Now, someone will say, oh, no, you spell Amy E. This is how she spelled her name and how her father spelled her name. I think if you go back far enough, they were with the same family as the Amys that are spelled with the E, but this is the correct spelling of her name. And her granddaughter, Nina McCullough Mattern. Nina. Sorry, Nina. Is this where you take over? Anyway, we were very fortunate because Melody was at the Historical Society, and so was Craig. When I came back from the post office and I opened an envelope, and lo and behold, there was this item that we're talking about. No, that's yours, right?
Yeah, make it go ahead.
Make it go ahead. We're quite a team. All right.
That's why we're a team.
That's it.
So those of you who are involved with the Historical Society or have been involved with history know it's always kind of exciting when some new piece of a collection comes into you. So one day in the mail, this sweet little photograph album arrived, and it said on the cover, "A Drive to Clinton Hollow," which excited Craig to no end. And just move it in.
Oh, ready?
It's very small. It's paper covered, little pink ribbons tying it. And so we began to look at it. And the note that came with it, this we're talking about one man's trash, said, "Dutchess County Historical Society, to whom it may interest." A couple of years ago, well, the long and short story is this man was hired to empty out a house in New Jersey, and as he did so, he found this little album, and something about it appealed to him, and so he kept it, but over the years he decided, I don't know why I'm keeping this. So to the point, I felt someone like yourself would be more interested in this folksy scrapbook than myself or the dumpster. So it was headed for the dumpster when it came back to us. So we opened it up and started looking, and this cover page says, "To my grandmother, Nina McCulloch." And so the first question we had was, well, is it to my grandmother, Nina McCulloch, or is it to my grandmother from Nina McCulloch? And that, of course, led us to begin to research these two names. And we ultimately discovered that the grandmother was Ophelia Shadbolt Amy, and the granddaughter was Nina McCulloch. So I think we're going to just at the beginning here skip through. Let me point out to you that we also thought, Craig and we have been having a conversation about whether this was an actual journey they made together, or is this some memory of times they shared together. It's really not clear, nor is it clear that we can actually date the photograph album. We're guessing it's 1905-ish, but there's no certainty. So the other thing that we've discovered in the last few weeks in looking at this is that Nina apparently was very well educated, and what we originally took to be little poems she'd composed to accompany the photographs actually turned out to be quotes from famous poems written by famous poets. So as we go through, we'll show you the album.
This one's Robert Burns, the little poet about, and they all tie very nicely. So we're showing you a picture of the page as it looks, and then a close-up of the photograph. This photograph, we'd love to figure out where that house is. We haven't yet.
And we're also debating whether this is Ophelia or whether this is Nina. We have a difference of opinion, so you'll all be able to vote later.
Next page was Fall Point Mill.
Right, so Winding and Grinding the Mill. This was a poem that was set to an old Irish tune. This you'll recognize.
At the end, Craig is going to do a comparison of, I know, but we can't for every little one. At the end, Craig's going to do a comparison of the old and the new.
Okay. So this is James Whitcomb Riley was the Frost on the Pumpkin. But anyway, I'm not going to bore you with who all the poets are, but there's some Shakespeare, there's a lot of Burns.
Clinton Hollow Post Office. Waiting for the mail, it says.
We don't know who the ladies are.
M.E. Reichert, you recognize the name. Oh, yeah, all right.
Really?
Okay. Well, maybe we should, let me read the words. It won't take long, I promise. I went the wrong way, so bear with me. Here, I'll do that. We covered Winding and Grinding, Round Goes the Mill. It says, road towards Salt Point, November chill blows loud with angry sigh. The shortening winter day is near a close. That's very poetic.
So this would be Hollow Road.
Which road is that, Craig?
It's Clinton Hollow Road. Clinton Hollow Road.
So that's Clinton Hollow Road.
Center Road south of Hollow.
What is it?
Center Road south of Hollow.
Center Road, south of Hollow.
It changes name at Hollow. Yeah.
Changes name at Hollow. Cool.
On the way to Salt Point. Right.
Halstead's Field, when the frost is on the pumpkin and the fodder's in the shock.
That's by James Whitcomb Riley.
Shocks are the corn.
Okay, I keep showing myself as a not.
There's your coin, Sean.
These are really nice. I mean, I suspect she took all of them, but I don't know. Clinton Hollow Post Office. This is the country grocery where all the farmers go to sit and chat and help to keep the pickle barrel low. I don't know. I guess.
That building's still there.
And then it says, waiting for the mail with joy and.
Unfeigned.
Thank you. Can I give you the microphone? With joy and unfeigned brothers and sisters meet, and each for theirs welfare kindly. Spears?
It's for Spears, and that's a poem by Robert Burns.
Yeah, it was.
Spears. Okay, I'm not familiar with the word. Sounds nice. Oh, well, the Spears. We'll have the Spears investigate it. I kind of figured out what everything was here, like the broom, but the thing just to the right of the broom, I have no idea. But some sort of long something. Oh, I see. Oh, it could be a planter. Oh, I see.
Something for constipation, nice.
There is something for constipation.
You can get anything at the general store.
When I was trying to date this, I looked up Shiloh's remedy, and this is likely to be after 1907 because wasn't the Food and Drug Administration. In 1907 they got very upset with everybody calling everything a cure, so they forced them to say remedy. So given that says it's a remedy, it might mean it's after 1907, because 1906 it was a cure. Hillstake chilled plows. I looked, and there are a lot of chilled plows. Does anyone know why plows would be chilled? But M.E. Reichert's, in this cottage used to be free-hearted hospitality. It even rhymes. Now that is an old house. There's a little sled out there too, and the clothes on the clothesline. And a ladder on the roof. I hadn't seen that. The Dowdy home. This says, and this our life exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. It's a nice thought.
From Shakespeare.
This house is on the left up Schoolhouse Road, just before the schoolhouse. House.
The Doties came over on Mayflower?
I don't know.
That's, I'm fairly sure. They were servants to the Hopkins family.
Oh, really? Okay, because we haven't learned much yet about the Dowdy family.
They had a lot of property around here.
They did.
Quakers. Yeah. Wasn't Dorothy Bukowski?
She was related, and that's who mentioned that her Doty relative was that from that line. They're buried back here.
Oh. Simple, nice house, and the well and the wagon. So that schoolhouse is there. Of course, now it's a house, I guess. Clinton Hollow Schoolhouse. Still sits the schoolhouse by the road, a ragged beggar sunning. Around it still sumac grows, and blackberry vines are running.
And that's from John Greenleaf Whittier. She's changed a couple words in this poem. She's adapted them for her own use.
And the funny thing is, you'll find later she talks about her schoolhouse not being red, because every schoolhouse is classically red. I noticed that the house is now painted red, but it wasn't in the past. There it is. The old homestead. I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. Now that's nice. Who is that?
I remember, that's Thomas Hood.
Thomas Hood. I don't think we located this house. And then that's the extent of the album.
So that got us very curious about who Ophelia Shadbolt Amy was. So Ophelia comes from a very complicated family home. And I think you've got a little bit of a genealogy here, Bill. So Ophelia's mother was a woman named Lydia Hodge. Lydia Hodges was first married to Henry Reichert. Lydia was Henry's second wife. Susanna Lyon, and there were Lyons in this area early on, was Henry's first wife. Lydia and Henry have 4 children, Joel, Mary Jane, Martin, and Phoebe. Joel dies young. Martin dies in 1864. The girls live to maturity. Mary Jane, to complicate things, marries her cousin, William Christopher Reichert. So we've got Mary Jane, who is a Reichert, marrying a cousin who's a Reichert, making the household a bit confusing. Henry dies in 1830, quite young. He was quite a bit older than Lydia when they married. He dies. They're married in 1821. He dies in 1830 after having these 4 children. She waits a few years, 8 years, and then she marries Riley Shadbolt. The Shadbolts appear to be Welsh, came into New York City. Riley's father ends up in Troy in politics. But for a while, they're living in Clinton Hollow, and we're not sure what brought them to Clinton Hollow, whether it was up to Troy and back or whatever. But Riley's younger brother is born here in Clinton Hollow, and there are references to Riley's father, Israel Shadbolt, opening a store at the head of Browning Road in 1829. In 1832, Israel runs for the state assembly from Clinton Hollow and is elected and serves here. We don't know when Israel takes off and goes up to Troy, but he continues in politics up there. So by her second husband, Riley, Lydia has 2 children. She has Ophelia, our subject, and she has Caroline. So in 1840, we find Riley's all over the place. One of the things you're going to learn this evening is that Ophelia did not have really what I would call terribly stable men in her life. And maybe later on you'll begin to see how it might have influenced her opinions. In 1840, we find... Pardon? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble reading, talking, and holding the mic all at the same time. In 1840, prior to when you have specifics in the census records, we know that there's 2 adults and 4 children in the household. In 1850, Riley's not in the household anymore. Lydia is living there. She dies 2 years later, but she's living with her children from her first marriage, Martin, Mary, Phoebe, and Ophelia and Caroline. So she's living, her oldest son, Martin, is really the head of the household in 1850. In 1860, Riley's living with some other folks in town. In 1870, now he's a laborer, but he's living in the household of William Reichert, which is his stepson by marriage. And by 1880, he's now in Poughkeepsie, and we'll follow them there. But you can see how complicated this household is at the very beginning.
What's the address?
Well, we know where Martin and W.E. Reichert's house was, and we'll show you when we get to the little map of Clinton Hollow. They were in different houses, but in the same general vicinity.
I just wanted to point out, these are some examples from the newspaper in 1849, where there was an anti-slavery convention at Washington Hollow, and Riley Shadbolt is mentioned, and he gets very involved in the anti-slavery movement, and he is the father of Ophelia.
So you know more about this. I'm handing it to him.
We may dispense with the mic, and I'll do a voiceover later. Shall we do that? Let's do that. We'll put it here, and then if it catches us, great. But we'd kind of like to talk to you, and it's getting in the way. So when you look at a map of the Clinton Hollow on the right, the one on the right is the close-up. And you can see that below the water where the big red arrow goes, W.C. Reichert. I'm not sure if there's still a house there or not.
There is.
There is?
I did look tonight as I
Oh, okay.
came by.
So that's,
It's a long driveway that goes back. There's a newer house toward the front, and where you see E, is it B or E Moody? On the 1850-something map for Clinton Hollow, that shows up as M Reichert. So they're both right in that general location.
Where is this map from?
so if this is the 1876 gray map. And if you look at the upper left where the school is, the upper red, remember I mentioned the house is still there? That's the one that says C. Doughty, just below the schoolhouse. That's the house that we looked at of the picture. P. Sweet, I know, is Pedro Sweet. He was very involved in politics. Run into him a lot. Anything else on this? Oh, just
So-
about her school years, perhaps.
So Ophelia, I'll spill the beans a little bit. Ophelia lives to be 97 years old. And when she is, or 99, I think, when she's 97, she's asked to write some sort of biographical newspaper article. And so she starts out talking about being born and reared in the town of Clinton, Dutchess County, on the eastern part of the state of New York, less than 5 miles from where our president, FDR, lives. I attended school in a little white schoolhouse instead of a red one. And as we were always fortunate in having good, intelligent men for trustees, they saw to it that in our school, we always had the best teachers that could be obtained. They were for years procured from the city of Philadelphia and of course belonged to the sect called Quakers by most people. But as our county was well in the majority so far as this was concerned, they were by us called Friends. We had the best of schools for our times as these teachers were calm and thorough and understood children. We commenced the morning exercise by reading a chapter in the Bible, after which questions were asked by the teacher to see who had and who had not paid attention to their reading. Those who had shown great inattention were told to remain in the room after they had eaten their dinner and study the morning's lesson. This same thoroughness was made available for all reading, spelling, and writing, and during my later years I often felt grateful for the way these teachers managed our schools and have wished that more of their methods were acceptable to the present generation. So she gives quite, I think, a thorough account of this school and the training that was going on there. So she's born in 1838, so we're talking 1848, 50, somewhere, and I think a very, very good overview of, and the idea that they were procuring Quakers from Philadelphia to come to Clinton Hollow
I didn't realize
to
that.
serve in these schools. There's some references and some information about her that suggests she also taught. We're not sure.
That was just to talk about present day, but I think we got that covered. It's kind of time for Ophelia's big adventures, right?
Well, so Ophelia marries Oscar Amy. Now, Oscar comes down this way, coming out of Hudson. We know he's living in Hillsdale at one point. He goes to the Amenia Seminary. When they're married they marry on March 13th, 1858. And on the marriage license, he says he is a professor of elocution. So somehow they marry. They're down here. And they probably move into that complicated household of the half-brothers and sisters, and Riley's there and Riley's not there, and we're not sure. So at one point, shortly after they marry, Oscar comes home, and he announces that it's time to make a change. And the reason that she says is because the son is taking over. So what we assume happened is that Lydia has died in 1852. Probably ownership of that household, those households, has been in flux. Martin, the oldest son, who doesn't live much longer, but Martin takes over. Oscar knows he's not going to inherit this property. So he comes home one day and he says, "Well, Ophelia, I've decided to go to Iowa. And I will go ahead of you and see how I like it, and also get a place for us to live in when you come. So he apparently has a cousin, and Oscar takes off in November of 1858, not knowing, probably not knowing, she probably doesn't know, that she's now pregnant with their first child. So he's gone, and Ophelia sets off on Valentine's Day, February 14th, great time to leave to travel west in 1859, to go to Iowa. She leaves from Clinton Hollow. We don't know. Bill and I have been looking online desperately to try and determine exactly how you went from Clinton Hollow to what ends up being Floyd Center, Iowa, through a place called Janesville, Wisconsin. So we're assuming there were direct routes somehow to Chicago. Janesville is a little west of there, and then up further to Floyd Center. So she claims, and Lydia made a lot of claims in her life, Ophelia, she claims she left on the 14th and in just 1 week reached my destination. Now, I'm not certain she reached her destination in a week, but that was Floyd Center, Iowa. I ask you younger citizens what you think of that speed as compared with transportation of this day and age. She says the slow traveling was but a little trifle compared with the other difficulties I found on the way. When I arrived at Janesville, Wisconsin, I found but one way to cross the river, and that was with horses and wagon on the ice. This was a new experience, and it did not look very inviting, inasmuch as I was the only woman with 11 men as passengers. However, these men were very kind and did their best to keep my courage up. We crossed the river without accident and landed safely at McGregor's Landing, which I scanned with a good bit of curiosity because I could not see any place that looked like an inn, tavern, or hotel. But soon there was a small building shown to me, at which I was told I could remain overnight and get my breakfast. So she eventually ends up, you want to go ahead, I think. She talks a little bit later about everything, it's freezing, it's thawing, the weather conditions are awful, the traveling conditions are terrible. I was told that on account of rough roads, where they had been thawed and then frozen again, were bad that morning, nothing could be used but what they called mud wagons, and horses would have to be changed every 10 miles. So she finally, as she repeats again, just 1 week from the time I left my home in the east, arrives in Floyd Center, Iowa. And what she finds, let's back up a minute, what she finds in Floyd Center, Iowa, didn't make her much happier. And it turns out that it wasn't exactly what the cousin had told them it was going to be like. Now, Floyd Center, Iowa, this part of Iowa that she moves to is being settled in 1852 and 53. So they're arriving 6 years later. There isn't much there. Housing conditions are poor. And by the way, there were still 2 Indian tribes hanging out in the neighborhood. And so she talks about the Indians and the Sioux and the Winnebago. And that the nice thing was the chief took quite a liking to them. And he used to pass by the place, but he couldn't talk, but he'd come in the house and sit by the fire. And eventually he saves them from a couple of arguing groups of Indians by just going out, according to her, and stopping the argument so that everything was fine. And she says, they were part of his tribe, and while we could not understand one word, we could see by looks and motions that he was delivering himself of some pretty strong language. At any rate, the young Indians climbed down their ponies and went on, and he went back to his blanket on our floor, and we were grateful that the old chief was present. So she talks about hunger being present for 6 months. They're settling in. By this time, her daughter Mary is born. Mary eventually comes back to Poughkeepsie. And so one would think that they would begin to settle in and homestead and develop their career, their future life in Floyd Center, Iowa, but no. What happens next is that we start moving into the period of the Civil War. And Oscar says, I'm going to go join the 3rd Iowa, and I'm going to go off and fight in the Civil War. And can you guess what Ophelia does? No, Ophelia says, I'm going with you. And I'm going to join as well. And so she does. And she goes off with him, and she follows the 3rd Iowa through the early part of the war, and is actually on the battlefield at the Battle of Shiloh. So in the meantime, she's pregnant for her 2nd child, who is born at a barracks in Missouri in 1861. And just because she's Ophelia, she happened to be at the Benton Barracks in Missouri, so she named the son Benton B. Amy. Sadly, he contracts typhoid a year later and dies, but I'm presuming that this child is carried around with her during the war, and when he dies, the soldiers are bereft. They say on July 2nd, 1863, died June 8, Benton B. Amy, the youngest child of Oscar and Ophelia Amy, died in St. Louis, Missouri, of whooping cough, age 1 year, 9 months, 8 days. This little one was born in Camp Benton, St. Louis, and has ever been the petted child of the 3rd Iowa Infantry Regiment, of which both parents were members at the time of his birth. Many brave soldiers mourn his death, for they had wished to see him, like themselves, a true-hearted defender of his country. So the rumor is that after he's born, within 3 weeks, she's back on the battlefield. So we begin to get a sense of Ophelia's feistiness in this period. I can say that there's a great-grandson of Ophelia's who's we have found and we have talked to, and he's done a fair amount of research on her, and he's part of a group that's very interested in the Battle of Shiloh. It's called a Shiloh Conversation Group. And he's put some interesting things online about her. Mrs. Ophelia Amy was in the 3rd. She was 23 when she enlisted as a nurse with her husband. There's a diary that he's found that has conversations about her and people who knew her during the war. And this diary is from a man named Wright. It says, Wright mentions both Ophelia and Oscar in his diary. Ophelia also tried to get Dr. Edwards fired. So this was a surgeon in the group at Shiloh, in the medical group at Shiloh. She did not like him. So she begins writing to people to get him fired. And this quote that was written about her, I think by her great-grandson, which I think in the end you will find sums her up. He says, she was an angelic despot who was maybe right, maybe wrong, but never in doubt. And I kind of like that. I like the whole idea. Shiloh nurses Belle Reynolds and Ophelia Amy had interesting professional careers for decades in Chicago. So these women hook up. This is Belle Reynolds. She's another Shiloh battlefield nurse. The descriptions of what these women were encountering as they were caring for the wounded during the Battle of Shiloh, or any Civil War battle, I'm sure, is absolutely horrific. The amputations, all of what's going on, and she's there and administering, and so there's quite a bit that's been written about it. She goes on, her friend Belle Reynolds goes on to be a physician at the Chicago Home for the Friendless, later a superintendent. Oscar's wounded at Shiloh. And the description is that Oscar was never right after the Battle of Shiloh. And as you'll see later, Oscar tends to move around and pop up in different places. But he's discharged early on in the war. I don't know where he goes. I don't know if Ophelia continues in the battlefield work. We haven't been able to track that down yet. But anyway, she writes to another woman. She writes to Annie Wittenmeyer during this time period. She's writing to her. Annie Wittenmeyer is a reporter who is visiting all the battlefields during the Civil War, and she's writing articles about the horrendous conditions, the lack of medical conveniences, the staffing. So Ophelia figures out who she's got to write to bring attention to her problem with this surgeon. And so she writes to Annie Wittenmeyer, and she's complaining fiercely about that surgeon. She's saying, "Now, Mrs. W., do what you can for us towards removing said doctor, and the third will bless you forever." So the reports of Pittsburgh Landing, the Battle of Shiloh, it's pretty much been reported it's not possible to establish how many women were there on that battlefield. But they do know that she was often in the battlefield, and that both she and Oscar, as well as others, were separated on the early mornings of the 6th when the battle actually starts at Shiloh. So the war ends, and the next thing we know that Oscar pops up, so then there is a third child born. So they're together somewhere toward the end of the war, because son Harry is born in Missouri in 1866. But that's in January, and in September, Oscar pops up in St. Louis as a book agent, and in about 1867, Ophelia returns to Poughkeepsie, where she is for the next 15 or so years. We know she's a matron at what was called the Friendly Inn. It was at 22 Cannon Street, and it was established by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She is the first secretary and president locally in Poughkeepsie of that. In 1880, she's living with her father. Do we have that census record? Maybe not, no. So in 1880, she's living with her children and her father in a boarding house at Poughkeepsie. There are a number of other men living there. They appear to be glassmakers and tradesmen in the city of Poughkeepsie. It would appear that she's running the boarding house. She becomes very involved. She joins the Red Cross as soon as it's formed in 1881. Oscar's moving back and forth. At one point, he's living in Martin Reichert's house. At one point, he's living in Dover. They appear never to have lived together again after the Civil War. But Oscar doesn't stay in St. Louis with the book business. He comes back. And so how much they're interacting with one another, we don't really know. So in 1882, Ophelia decides Poughkeepsie's too small for her. And this is it's the same year, and it puzzles me a little bit. Her oldest daughter, Mary, the middle baby has died. Harry is still alive. Mary, the oldest child, is married in Poughkeepsie. And Mary stays here her entire life. I don't know when Mary comes back, probably with her mother right after the Civil War. Mary never leaves Poughkeepsie again. And in 1882, just as Mary is about to give birth to our other subject, Nina, Ophelia decides she's going to Chicago. Now, there are a couple reasons why she may have been going to Chicago. One of her half-sisters was living in Chicago, so she did have some family out there. Belle, her Civil War nurse friend, was now in a hospital in Chicago. And Chicago, here they are, I think. Chicago, by this time, is the second largest city in the United States. And it is said that Chicago grew more quickly in the second half of the 19th century than any other large city in the history of the modern world. By 1900, there were 1.7 million people living in Chicago. And it became, I think in this time period, perhaps the most important city in the history of the progressive movement and women in the country, if you think about women like Jane Addams being there in this time. So Belle is there. The progressive movement is exploding. The reformers are struggling to try and remedy the ills and tensions that were prompted by massive social changes that were occurring in the last part of the 19th century. Hull House is built by Jane Addams. So Ophelia arrives and she starts getting involved in a couple places out there. One is called the Airing Women's Refuge. And she's also involved with the Chicago Home for the Friendless. So her experiences at the Friendly Inn in Poughkeepsie, where she's taking care of homeless boys and supposedly injured veterans, somehow she's lured to Chicago, perhaps by the movement that's going on there. And I think it's fair to say she becomes pretty radicalized in her positions, which is maybe hard to reconcile with Clinton Hollow, I'm not sure. But she ends up out there, and try to see if there was anything more. There's a whole, if you're interested, I mean, I'm interested in women's history, obviously, but you know, there's a lot of work being done now on this progressive era in Illinois in women's history and what they're calling the second generation of female activists, and that they were the ones that broke the bonds of the feeling of, you know, the Victorian imperative, the cult of true womanhood, and all of these things that didn't allow women to have voices, that kind of tied them to home, family, and church. Well, that's not Ophelia. You know, she's not there. So she's out here in 1882, and shortly thereafter, in 1893, the Chicago Area Women's Refuge for the Reformed joins with the Board of Trustees of the State Home for Juvenile Offenders. And in August 1894, they purchased 51 acres of farmland that becomes the Illinois State Training School for Delinquent Girls. And guess who's the first superintendent? So Ophelia, in May of 1895, so the purpose of this home was the confinement, education, and reformation of girls, 10 to 16, who had been convicted of offenses punishable by law. Now, Illinois is not only progressive for women, but Illinois happens to be the first state where there's actually a juvenile court system for children. Up until the point that Illinois puts it in place a little bit later, children that get into trouble are treated as just small adults. So, but in 1895, they're establishing this school. And in May 1895, Ophelia and 8 girls move into the original farmhouse. And this is ultimately what the campus looked like. It continued until 1977. By 1909, the acreage of the campus had grown to 241 acres. In 1896, they have the first permanent building constructed. The description is that the girls were housed in small bare rooms, dressed in state-issued dresses, locked in rooms except when in school, working or during chapel or recreation. They were taught trades. It was supposed to be a Reformation school. Baking, typing, became co-ed in 71 and then closed in 77. So Ophelia emerges, and I'm sure she has to have known Jane Addams. She has to have known these women working in this field out there. It's not that big a world. So things are going along pretty good. Ophelia's tough. She's complaining that her school doesn't get as much money as the school for boys. She's chafing under the rules. She's breaking the rules. If they tell her she can't have money for furniture, she does it anyway. She's arguing with all of the male leaders in Chicago. She's making a name for herself, and ultimately they decide they've had enough of Ophelia. And so in 1911, on July 1st, they allege misconduct, and they accuse her of violating the rules, and they fire her from her position. They say she's purchased furniture without authorization, that she's used strong chairs to restrain girls, that she had a rawhide whip in her drawer. And she replies, goes to the press on July 8th and pleads her case and says, this is ridiculous, none of this happened, yes, I restrained the girls, but I had to, don't you understand the circumstances? Her defense is that these were violent women, violent young women, and that if they weren't restrained, they were going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. But she's not reinstated. Her great-grandson has read all of her annual reports that she filed in the 15 or so years she was the superintendent. And he says it's a setup. He says she was set up, that she was just too argumentative, that she was giving them too many problems, and they just weren't going to have it anymore. And that all the reports after her by another matron were all like, yes, sir, what would you like me to do? Everything's fine. So she ends her career there, but not for long. She next pops up. But this is Bill finds this a little kooky. Anyway, I don't know, I have yet to work out in my mind her positions. She becomes very obsessed with protecting young women. And I don't think it's unusual for the time period. I think it's perhaps common and fits in the context of these very progressive righteous. I think righteous is a word I would use for her. She begins to write about the traffic in white slavery. She's quoted in 1906. She gives a soul-stirring address on degenerate girls, tracing the chief causes of their degeneracy to the use of alcohol by parents and ancestors. Remember, she's founded the WCTU. Her friend Wittenberger is the first president of the WCTU, so she's heavily, heavily tied into temperance activities. July 1909, she writes a long expose warning parents about letting their daughters go on summer excursion boats in Chicago, that gambling is rampant on the summer excursion boats. Girls are entrapped, forced to marry on the other side of the lake, and then when they come back, they're sold into white slavery in what she calls the silly season. She's arguing with the leaders in Chicago, saying, you're sending me these girls. And remember, this is a period when Chicago is full of immigrants, people living on the streets. There's not a lot of money. Young girls are getting pregnant. She's getting the girls into her training school as they're pregnant. She's being asked to help them recover, but then when they have their babies, she's saying that they're putting them right back on the streets. She claims that many of them are suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome, so she is writing these papers on this. And I think that probably also contributed to her lack of popularity among the leaders of Chicago. But when she's left there, when she's finished there, by 1913, so 1911 is her demise, if you will, in Chicago, but through friendships she'd made around the country, because she was traveling the country giving lectures in many huge cities on this topic and on these problems. And so she's asked then to go to Birmingham, Alabama, which is not really a very popular place at that time either. But in 1913, she moves to Birmingham, Alabama to become the superintendent of the Girls' Home for the Friendless. And so, you have to ask yourself if her reputation was so badly damaged in Chicago, how does she show up in Birmingham doing the same thing all over again? She is the superintendent of the Alabama State Training School for Girls from 1918 to 1924. In 1924, she retires from that, but she becomes a parole officer. In 1927, at 88, she's the oldest delegate to the National Conference of Social Workers in Des Moines. She finally retires in 1931, and in January 31st, 1939, she passes away in Birmingham, where she's buried. The reports are that she was buried with full military honors. We haven't been able to document that. In the meantime, her father, who had been living with her in Chicago, had passed away, and she's alone, really, in Birmingham, having never come back permanently to the Northeast. But then we have a set that we'll finish up the story with Nina. I think that's where we are now.
So we have to go back, rewind a little bit to when Melody was talking about the daughter getting married, and this is her granddaughter. Nina Mattern McCulloch is born in Poughkeepsie in 1882. Sorry, it's off by 10 years. She was born in 1882. She dies in 1918. All the numbers are wrong, so just don't. That's part of the quiz later, but
They're the right numbers, they're just in the wrong place.
let's just move on from that slide. It's getting tired. We put this in here because in the Poughkeepsie directory for 1881 to 82, what you find is there's at the top Ophelia and her son Harry and Mary, and yet it is a transition. It's covering both ears. The McCullochs there, Edward R. and son Robert. Son Robert, the upholsterer at 6 Thompson Street, is the man that the daughter marries. And I would imagine that 6 Thompson Street, I checked, there's no longer a house at 6 Thompson Street in Poughkeepsie. Like in many things in Poughkeepsie, it's empty. And I would imagine that Nina was born at 6 Thompson Street, the son of Robert and the daughter of Ophelia. The premise of the book is that Nina is thanking Ophelia for being her grandmother and inspiring her, and the scrapbook takes her back to the grandmother's birthplace and formative years where school was. And it's very obvious very quickly to see why Nina was so enamored of her grandmother. She's very active in the women's suffrage movement. When the war comes along, she's very active in the Women's Land Army. She has all the kind of hallmarks of Ophelia, but is a lot more homebound, if you will. So she gets known as a suffragist, as a patriot, as an activist, as a speaker. She goes town to town to town. She's been in Clinton. She's been in every town in the area, largely promoting suffragists. She gets interrupted by that when her brother Frederick dies during the global flu pandemic in September, October of 1918. She goes and nurses him and then comes back to Poughkeepsie. The global flu pandemic kills 98% of the people that it's going to kill between September, October, and November of 1918. The yellow bars are the number of people getting killed in the US by the flu, and the black bars are the people dying in the war, because, as you know, September, October, leading up to November 11th, are the peak battles of the World War I, which finally bring it to a very painful end. But there's kind of this unthinkable alignment of the spike of the flu pandemic and the deadliest part of the World War. And it's right in those months, September, October, that theaters are closed, telephones go down, you can't go to church, the government's trying to, they don't really know what to do except to tell you to try not to cough or sneeze, because they themselves don't really know what to do. We, I think, forget the scale of the death. We all call it the Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with Spain, except that Spain was the only country that did not have censorship. So the news about the deaths in Spain were getting out, and it was described as incorrectly as the Spanish flu. If you were reading the Poughkeepsie paper, you'd see on page 9 in May of 1918 that the king gets this flu in Spain. It's a tiny little mention. There's May when he's mentioned, and then there are the global spikes that kill 80 and 90% of the people just a few months down the road. She herself dies from the flu. She is in, I didn't know if I had a picture. There I do. This is a picture of the Masonic Hall in Poughkeepsie. This was turned into an emergency ward for people dying from influenza that turned into pneumonia. So she was running this sick room and unfortunately came down with the flu. So, of course, you get this obituary that explains, we could have done the program flipped. We could have had as much about Nina as we did about Ophelia, with the tributes that came in because of she's described as an ardent worker for suffrage at both the state and then for the national level, founder of the Women's City Club. Anyway, the tributes come in from the mayor and from clergy. This is a description of her funeral. Poughkeepsie women gave her life aiding others, very much, right? The mold of Ophelia was conspicuous in public life. And if in September, October of 1918, you're reading the Sunday Poughkeepsie paper, the obituary started halfway down the front page and then went through page by page. I know in New York City, they had run out of coffins. The speed and volume of people dying was, and the extraordinary thing, of course, was the younger and healthier you were, the more likely you were to die. It's the way that particular virus or disease was designed. I can't help but mention this example. This Otis Murray, who rests in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, said goodbye to his family. He goes off to war. He lives to come back, but his mother, his father, his 2 brothers, and his grandmother all die from the flu. So he's the only one. They're all in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, but kind of a reversal of what you'd expect. He's the only one in the family to survive. He comes back, and he has no family. And he lives till 1973. Nina's also buried there, and those are the correct dates, 82 to 1918, fortunately for her. So I think we kind of wrap up, and then we're going to ask Craig to take us through some contemporary photos. Thank you. Slideshow.
Thank you very much. Am I set to go?
Should be.
Yep. Okay. Can you imagine all the research that went into what you just heard? It's just amazing. Pardon me? I should use the microphone. I will use the microphone. Okay, my part in this is I want to take you on a carriage tour. We're going to duplicate or replicate the tour that Nina went on. At least that's the story I believe. As you heard at the beginning, we're not clear whether they rode together through the Salt Point Turnpike out to Clinton Hollow or they ran separately. We don't know. My story is that the picture that you saw on the first with the lady in the carriage, that is Ophelia, the grandmother. And that picture was taken by Nina with her camera. And then as they went on to the road, Salt Point Turnpike to Clinton Hollow, she stopped and took several views. And I thought it would be fun if we saw what those views look like today, 100 years later. And that's the trip that we're going to go on. So here we go. No, we don't. What happened there?
That's the presentation.
Okay. I think this is Ophelia. And she's in her carriage, and after the picture's taken, Nina jumps on and off they go. In the interest of time, our carriage is going to have 3 horses. We're going to go a little fast, okay? And this is not the yeah, but this is not where we need to be. So I'm not sure what's happened here. This is where are you? Hang on a minute. What happened?
Because I don't do PowerPoint. You sent me a PowerPoint, and that's it. I don't know
Okay.
what to say.
Hang on for 2 seconds. We're going to change computers.
While you're changing computers, if anyone has any questions, happy to answer.
So, where was Ophelia living in 1905, 1915? Around the time of this carriage tour might have taken place.
She's gone in 1913. She goes down to Birmingham.
So she's living in Birmingham.
And there's some newspaper reports that say she made a practice of coming back to Poughkeepsie every couple of years. Now, probably when she got older in age, and maybe even when she got to Birmingham, I don't know how easy it would have been to get from Birmingham back here. That's where she was by 1913. Yes.
In 1858, how established was the railroad system? And could she have taken the railroad like
She-
Chicago?
We looked at a lot of early maps. There was a pretty good railroad system, certainly between here and Chicago.
Right.
She only mentions Janesville. She mentions the mud wagons. She doesn't talk about trains. She doesn't talk about rivers. She doesn't talk about crossing on boats. If you were going the whole way by horseback, I looked up the mileage. A horse can go easily 20 miles a day, but that's going to take her 50-some days. I just don't know what she was picking up. I would have thought she would have mentioned railroad, but she doesn't. I don't think she had a lot of money. I don't know what the cost of travel by train would have been. I would have thought it would be expensive. That would be my guess.
Okay, we're back on the wagon. We got 3 horses. Thank you. Good thing you're here. Put it in your pocket.
May I ask a quick question? Is that like Amyville Road?
The Amy's do go back to the Amy's in Beekman that were spelled E-M-I-G-H.
Oh, because there's E-I-G-H.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. That's just
Okay, we're going to start the tour. This is a virtual carriage tour. 3 horses, we're going fast. So we start off at the Poughkeepsie site. Ophelia is on the wagon, having her picture taken by Nina. Nina jumps on the wagon. They go off to Salt Point, headed towards Clinton Hollow. They get to Salt Point, and there's a bridge there. And from the bridge, Nina takes the picture of the dam and the mills. And this is interesting because this particular site, this bridge, was the scene of 2 photographs used for postcards. So this is a postcard that says Mill Dam Salt Point, and you can see the 2 buildings that were in her picture. And this is a colorized version, and you notice that there's a White House back in the background. If we go back to Nina's picture, there's the White House. So, wrong way. So the next stop, this is that's all that's left of the dam today at Salt Point. We get on to, she goes a few hundred yards to the Clinton Hollow Road. She makes a left where the auto body is, Matt's auto body is today. And she turns left, she's on the Clinton Hollow Road, and she's going down along that road. And along the road, you can see the stream bed, you can see the dirt road, and the road goes around here. It's going to go around this hill, and you can see a White House here. If you were there, look at there today, you can see that we have the road that's going to go around the hill. The stream bed is here, and it appears that the roadway has been lifted so that the road is not as muddy when the stream overflows. This is what it looks like today, again in color, living color. She gets to Hollow Road. She turns left, she only goes a few hundred yards, and she gets to the Clinton Hollow store, where they were picking up the mail, as in the picture that you saw. That store, that building today is still there, and you can see this is Hollow Road going downhill towards the bridge, and the doorway was at that time on the side, and today that doorway is in the front because of the speeding automobiles coming down here. They moved the doorway, but the overhang is still there for the store. Now this store was owned by Alice Riker for many years. She started in 1930. She went 32 years before she stopped the business. Alice lived across the street at this house that Nina took a picture of. And you saw that, if you remember the map, it was down over here in Clinton Hollow. Well, that house that you saw on the map is this house. And if you notice this crosshatch here, another strange thing happened. I've only been able to buy one picture off eBay of any Clinton house. Would you believe that the house that I was able to buy is this house? All right. So what we have here is this picture, and here again, if you look at the crosshatch, we see the same familiar thing, right? And the names of the Reicherts are all on the back of this picture. So what a find. Now strangely, we have yet another picture of this house, and when it was being abandoned. And the reason it was being abandoned is because Reicherts built another house between this house and the road, halfway. So that's the house that's there today, that's lived in by the Montroses. And this one was, the note on this picture said William Reichert House was built in 1855. So this house is no longer there, but it was a Reichert property, and Alice lived in the house, the Reichert house, for many years until she died. And then the Montroses bought it. What happened next is Nina turned right onto Schoolhouse Road, which is a few yards beyond the bridge, and she went to the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse is still there. If you notice these two windows, then this is that building today, and those two windows are here and here, and the door is gone. It's been moved over to the side. And it may recognize a little bit better in color. That's what it looks like today. So she then went to the Doty house, and she took this picture. And that Doty house, there were Dotys in the area at that time. You saw that on the map. And that house today looks like this. And if you see these three windows, those three windows are 1, 2, 3. And if you look at another view, there's a window down here, and that window is on the other side of the chimney, and that you can see over here. So we have two pictures of the Doty house. My view is that this picture was taken by Nina on the way back home. And this is, if you remember the first picture of the muddy road, it was, it was back here someplace, and you come up this hill and you go around a very sharp turn on Clinton Hollow Road. What you notice in this picture is the stone wall. The road is from here to here. It's going like this, and the stream runs along that way. If you were to look at it today, you can see the stone wall, the road turning around as it used to, and you can see the stream. And in living color, you may recognize it better. It looks like this today. So we found this very interesting as we were able to take this wagon ride 100 years later and see several of the sites that Nina took pictures of and the road that her and her grandmother took. Okay, so we'd like to thank Nina for not only taking the pictures. Okay, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Where was the Doty house?
It was.
Somebody said, where is he?
Just below the schoolhouse, just south of the schoolhouse on the same side of the road.
Okay, I'm not done.
Oh, sorry.
I thought it would be interesting to talk about, for a moment, the camera. How did Nina take these pictures? Well, the popular camera at the time was the Brownie No. 2. Cost $2 in 1904, which is about $60 today. And just as further evidence that this was a popular camera, here's a group of female students of the Glen Eden Finishing School, and you can see that they are carrying their Brownie 2 cameras. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So we'd like to thank Melody and Bill and the Dutchess County Historical Society for the wonderful things that we do.
So if there are any
Come again.
questions- Good, if there are any questions.
We will entertain questions. Yes.
Do you know anyway how it got to New Jersey, those pictures? How it ended up there?
Yes, another granddaughter moved with the last name of Pitcher, I think. Bill?
Pitcher, yep.
Barbara Pitcher moved down to, I think, Princeton, down in that neighborhood, and that's how it ended up there.
The man who was cleaning the house out after it had been sold and found it.
So who would think all this story would come out of that darn little picture book, huh? Yeah.
I love the fact for the Rhinebeck Gazette paper, their tagline was, if your business isn't good enough to advertise it for sale.
Any other questions?
Okay.
If you,
Dick, could you hit the lights? And we have our refreshments, and we invite you to join us again for our future programs. And we will have a summer exhibit this year as well. So you'll be getting news about that. So thank you all for coming.